Daniel Carter's car rolled slowly up the winding road to Miller's Hill, the engines struggling against the steep incline. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the town behind swallowed in a haze of fog and shadow. The locals had warned him, not with threats, but with uneasy glances and hurried murmurs, but Daniel had never been one to shy from danger. A journalist's curiosity, after all, was rarely tempered by fear, and Miller's Hill promised a story no one else dared chase. The graveyard appeared at the crest of the hill, a jagged silhouette against the evening sky. Twisted oaks leaned over the crumbling gravestones, their branches like skeletal fingers scraping the mist. The iron gate groaned when Daniel pushed it open, echoing across the deserted hill. Every step he took was muffled by a thick layer of fallen leaves, damp from the evening dew. He paused beside the first row of graves. The names were old, worn away by time, but one caught his eye. Eleanor Whitmore, 1892 to 1910. The engraving was sharp, almost fresh. Daniel frowned and ran his fingers across the letters. A chill shot up his spine, not from the cold, but from something intangible, something alive in the air around him. He shivered. The graveyard was quiet, yet a faint rustle of movement teased the edges of his hearing. As he ventured deeper, the path became overgrown, forcing him to duck under low-hanging branches. Shadows shifted unnaturally among the tombstones, lengthening, shrinking, sometimes appearing where no one could be. Then he saw it, a small leather-bound journal tucked beneath a leaning tombstone. Curious, he picked it up and opened the brittle pages. The entries chronicled murders that mirrored recent headlines, down to the chilling detail of the victim's last moments. Daniel's pulse quickened. How could these deaths be recorded here, in a graveyard untouched by modern life? A sudden whisper drew his attention. At first he thought it was the wind rustling through the dry leaves, but the voice was unmistakable, low, beckoning, almost human. "Daniel," it called, soft and insistent. He spun around, heart hammering, but saw only the rows of weathered stones and the thickening fog. Something moved behind the tallest oak. A shadow flitted, too swift and deliberate to be mere wind. Daniel took a cautious step forward, compelled despite the fear curling in his stomach. His flashlight illuminated graves with names he recognized from recent unsolved deaths. Each step made the whispers louder, clearer, weaving together fragments of stories that seemed to seep from the ground itself. The air grew heavier, thick with anticipation, like the graveyard itself was waiting for him to cross some unseen threshold. By the time darkness fully claimed the hill, Daniel had set up a small camp near the entrance. His eyes constantly darted to the shifting shadows beyond the light of his lantern. Every so often, a whisper would slip through the fog, promising secrets, horrors, and revelations, if only he dared to listen. And Daniel, driven by a hunger he could barely explain, knew he could not leave. Miller's Hill had him now, and the night had only just begun. Night had deepened, and a thick fog curled around the tombstones like living smoke. Daniel Carter sat hunched over the leather-bound journal, the lantern casting quivering shadows across his face. Every page seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. As he read, a chilling thought gnawed at him. The entries described murders that had yet to occur. Names, dates, even the methods of death. Details that no one outside this cursed graveyard could possibly know. A soft scrape of metal on stone made him freeze. His eyes darted across the misty expanse, trying to pierce the gloom. There, at the far end of the graveyard, a freshly carved tombstone caught his attention. The name etched into the marble made his blood run cold. Daniel Carter, 1989, ? The question mark seemed to mock him. His heart thudded violently against his ribs. Surely it was a prank, but the tombstone was real, solid, and terrifyingly permanent. Compelled by fear and curiosity in equal measure, Daniel approached the stone. The moment his fingers grazed the surface, a vision crashed into him. He was no longer standing in the graveyard. He was reliving someone's death. Cold metal pressed against his chest, a scream trapped in his throat. He felt the fear, the betrayal, the final heartbeat of a life snatched too soon. The vision ended abruptly, leaving him gasping and drenched in sweat. Whispers swirled around him, forming words this time, coherent and urgent. Follow, finish, witness. They beckoned him toward the center of the graveyard, where the mausoleum loomed like a jagged tooth. Each step he took was echoed by unseen footsteps, crunching on the leaves and earth. Shadows shifted and writhed around him, forming grotesque shapes that flitted just beyond the lantern's glow. Inside the mausoleum, the air was suffocating, thick with dust and the scent of decay. The walls were lined with plaques, each bearing names of the long dead, and some he recognized from recent news reports. At the center, atop a stone pedestal, lay an enormous book bound in cracked black leather, the Chronicle of the Restless. Its pages glimmered faintly, as though illuminated by some unnatural light. Daniel's hand trembled as he opened it. Each page displayed a story, murders and disappearances that had already happened, alongside entries that were blank, waiting. And then, a page near the middle, his name, his own story partially written, the words forming as he watched. The whispers had grown louder, surrounding him in a chorus of demands. Write it, or be written, be part of us. Panic clawed at him, but the thrill of the story, the irresistible pull of truth kept him rooted. The graveyard wasn't merely haunted, it was alive, a predatory entity feeding on the curiosity and fear of those who dared enter. Every grave, every tombstone was a vessel for stories that had refused to die, and Daniel realized with a sinking horror that the graveyard wasn't just showing him tales of death, it was shaping them. A shadow detached itself from the corner of the mausoleum, tall and indistinct. It moved toward him, whispering in a voice like rustling leaves. Daniel stumbled back, clutching the journal and the lantern, knowing in his gut that the night had only begun and that the horrors of Miller's Hill were far from
tried
finished.
to flee the mausoleum, but the paths beyond twisted unnaturally, looping back on themselves as if the hill itself had a mind. Every step forward only brought him back to the same cold stone walls. Shadows stretched and contorted across the ground, crawling like living ink and whispering his deepest fears aloud. faces emerged from the darkness, those of the long dead and the recently vanished, twisted in rage, sorrow, and silent accusation. The journal he carried trembled in his hands. New entries had appeared, written in a spidery, alien hand, detailing murders that hadn't yet occurred. Daniel's pulse raced. The graveyard wasn't content with merely recording deaths. It was creating them, and if he didn't act, he would be next. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his throat. The fog swallowed it, as though the hill refused to let him disturb its stories. Ahead, a cluster of freshly dug graves caught his eye. The soil heaved as if something underneath stirred. Names of people he knew appeared on the headstones, ink dark and wet, yet the bodies were still alive somewhere, soon to be claimed by the graveyard. His stomach churned in horror. The hill was not just haunted, it was predatory, hungry for the stories of the living. Daniel's terror gave way to determination. The chronicle of the restless was his only chance. The mausoleum's central pedestal glowed faintly in the moonlight, the black leather book open, waiting. A whisper, now unmistakably human, circled him. Write, or become part of us forever. Shadows pressed closer, fingers of darkness clawing at his coat, tugging him toward the freshly opened graves. With trembling hands, he approached the book. As he read the empty pages, he realized the horrifying choice before him. To escape, he would have to write his story, every fear, every encounter, every detail of his descent into Miller's Hill. But by writing it, he would bind a piece of his soul to the graveyard, ensuring he was never truly free. Hesitation gnawed at him, but the shadows surged, and he felt the first cold fingers of the hill's grasp on his shoulder. He began to write, his pen moving almost of its own accord. Each word summoned visions around him, the dead rising, eyes blazing with expectation, fresh graves splitting open, whispers screaming in countless voices. Sweat ran down his face as he inscribed every terrifying moment he had witnessed since arriving on the hill. The hill shook with a low, rumbling growl, testing him, threatening to drag him into its eternal story if he faltered. Hours, or perhaps minutes he could no longer tell, passed. With each sentence the shadows recoiled, writhing and screaming before dissolving into the fog. Finally, Daniel scrawled the last word. The hill trembled one final time and then fell silent, the fog dissipating as if it had never been. The newly carved tombstones collapsed into dust, and the twisted oaks no longer seemed to watch him. Daniel staggered out of the mausoleum, clutching the chronicle to his chest, shaken but alive. Yet even as he descended Miller's Hill, he knew something had changed. The voices lingered, faint but insistent, reminding him that freedom came at a price, and that Miller's Hill would not forget him. Daniel Carter emerged from the mausoleum into the pale light of dawn, the fog lifting to reveal Miller's Hill in a deceptive calm. His legs trembled, every step heavy with exhaustion. The chronicle of the restless was clutched tightly against his chest, the weight of its power pressing down on him like a physical burden. He had survived the night, but he felt changed. The hill had allowed him to leave, yet he could sense its gaze lingering, an invisible hand brushing against his back, reminding him that the escape was only temporary. The town lay silent as he descended the hill, streets empty, doors closed, windows shuttered. When he tried to speak of what had happened, the words faltered in his throat. The townspeople listened politely, but saw only exhaustion and obsession in his eyes. They had heard stories before, tales of Miller's Hill, but none had dared venture close. Daniel realized with a pang of dread that no one would ever truly understand the horrors he had faced. Back in his small apartment, he placed the chronicle on his desk. The pages were filled with the stories he had written, his own descent, the horrors of the graveyard, and every chilling encounter with the restless dead. As he traced the inked lines with his finger, he noticed something that made his stomach tighten. A new entry at the very end, written in the same spidery hand that had filled the blank pages. It read simply, "The story is never finished. The next chapter waits." At night, Daniel's dreams were no longer his own. He awoke to whispers echoing through his apartment, voices familiar yet impossible, recounting the deaths, fears, and secrets of those buried on Miller's Hill. Sometimes, in the reflection of his mirror, he glimpsed shadows that were not his own, moving independently, waiting, watching. Even though he had survived, part of him remained tethered to the hill, bound by the stories he had been forced to write. Despite the terror, Daniel could not stop himself from opening the chronicle again, compelled by a mix of curiosity and dread. Each page seemed alive, words shifting as if feeding on his attention. He knew that the hill was still out there, waiting for the next soul curious enough or foolish enough to climb its winding road. And though he could warn others, he understood the truth. No one would listen. The graveyard thrived on disbelief, and the stories it craved would continue, year after year, feeding on the living. As dawn broke fully over the town, Daniel stepped to the window, staring up at the distant hill. The fog had vanished, the twisted oaks still, the tombstones buried beneath the earth. Yet in his mind he could hear them, the whispers, the scratching of claws on stone, the soft, coaxing call of the dead. Miller's Hill was silent for now, but it would never truly rest. And Daniel knew that, though he had walked away alive, he was forever part of its story. The chronicle lay open, its pages glowing faintly in the morning light. Every grave still had a story to tell, and every story still had the power to kill.